Readers Entertainment Radio presents Booklights with your host, author Lisa Kessler. Booklights, where we're shining a light on good books.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Booklights today. We are halfway through October. Can you believe it? And everyone who is a frequent listener knows that I devote October to everything spooky. It's my favorite season of the year. And I'm super excited for you guys to get to meet Jeremy Dauber. He is the author of American Scary, so it's right with our theme. And he has all kinds of amazing different genre type books. So we'll try and talk about them all today, but leading with the spooky. So if you've never read Jeremy yet, you are in for a big treat. I'll read his bio here so you can get to know him and then we'll chat. So Jeremy Dauber is a professor of Jewish literature and American studies at Columbia University, where he has also served as director of its Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies. He received his undergraduate degree, cum laude, from Harvard, so he's real smart, guys, and his doctorate from the University of Oxford, which he attended as a Rhodes Scholar. His most recent books are American Scary, American Comics, A History, which was featured on the cover of the New York Times Book Review, and also Mel Brooks' Disobedient Jew. And anyone who is a longtime listener knows I'm a huge Mel Brooks fan, so we will definitely talk about that too. As J.A. Dauber, he is also the author of a YA novel, Mayhem and Madness, Chronicles of a Teenaged Supervillain, which was a young adult's choice for the Children's Book Council. A new middle grade novel, currently titled Press 1 for Invasion, will be published by Simon & Schuster's Aladdin books next year. He frequently lectures on topics related to American pop culture, Jewish literature, history, and humor at venues throughout the United States and internationally. You can learn even more at his website, which there is a link right there in the show notes. So you can check it out and see where he's speaking and which books are coming out next. So anyway, be sure to check that out. So without any further delay, Jeremy, how are you?
Good, Lisa. How are you? Nice to see you and to talk with you.
Yes,
on the podcast.
Well, I'm really excited about American Scary. I cannot wait to read it. Can you tell everybody kind of what inspired this and what they can find in there?
Sure. I have been a horror fan, certainly a fan of horror fiction from way back when I was much too young to read Stephen King. And
hey, me too.
Right? Right?
Your parents go, what are you reading?
Yeah, and why are you up this late? You should be asleep by now. And I'm like, I can't. So, as I got older and, my fears sort of, transformed from vampires to other kinds of things. I started teaching, I said, you know what? It would be interesting to tell a story about how real life fears and fictional fears in America kind of combine and they influence each other and they go back and forth and how we make sense of ourselves and our history through looking at fictions and real life terrors. And so I decided to write something that tried to encompass in a fun way the whole shebang from Salem to Stephen King and beyond.
I love it. I love it. So when people read this book, are they going to hear like real life history and also like the history of, Nosferatu scary movies and books, or how's it?
That's exactly it. And the way in which those two things work with each other. So for example, just to take one example, in the immediate period after World War II, everyone was very afraid of nuclear annihilation, right? It was a real life fear. And there were some movies, right, that really sort of took that head on. Things like Dr. Strangelove or Failsafe and things like that. I talk about those. But I also talk about the way in which alien invasion in science fiction movies, and which featured radioactivity or things from beyond coming down to rain deadly fire on your head, really were a way of Americans kind of also working through some of those fears without actually having to face them sort of directly head on. So it's the way that the headlines go back and forth to fiction, and then that sort of again re-influences how we think about the real life.
And how do you, there have been multiple times in our American timeline when real life history and fictional kind of accidentally intersected. Like I'm thinking of War of the Worlds and when Blair Witch first came out and it came out like a documentary on TV and we're all like, right. What? Do you talk about those two?
I talk about those two a good bit, and I love both those examples that you're giving. I mean, they're so important and they're so much fun. And part of my job is to sort of tell the fun of this all, and to try and put you back into 1938, and sort of turning on your radio. Maybe you turned it on 5 minutes late and you didn't hear that announcement that this is based on H.G. Wells, and you're running out screaming into the street. Or maybe you didn't get, the memo that this is Blair Witch is actually not a real found footage, and really, put you back into 1999, that far off land of 1999. But and part of it is saying, well, they talk about the War of the Worlds in 1938, and everyone is thinking about another War of the Worlds that's sort of right around the corner. Mm-hmm. And how do those two things sort of come together? As well, and so digging a little deep, but also having a fun ride. That was sort of challenge, and I hope I pulled it off.
Right. And you have kind of a background in humor. How did you also get sucked into horror?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I think humor and horror have a lot in common, and in two ways. One of them is that they're both blueprints into the psyche of a culture. If you find out what makes a culture laugh, if you find out what makes it afraid, you really can kind of understand it. And the other thing is that, it's a really fun way as a cultural historian and people who care about culture of understanding what audiences are thinking and what works. If you write a poem and someone is like, I don't get that poem at all, the poet can say, well, I'm, Emily Dickinson. I don't care if you, don't understand it. I'm a genius. If you tell a joke and nobody laughs, you've got to keep thinking. And I think that's true at horror movies too, right? If there are lots of different ways to scare people, and we can talk about that. But if you don't scare people at all, then you've probably done something wrong.
Right. And you can think about like humor wise, when TV started to come in and we started realizing, Brits have a different sense of humor than Americans, and some people just don't get Monty Python. And, so it's interesting how each, country has their own version of humor and probably horror too, right?
100%. And it's so much fun, to really focus on one country, our country, but also to talk about how sometimes that stuff makes its way in by little, at particular moments in an inkling. So, there's a point around the turn of the 20th century when people like H.G. Wells are coming in, the sort of the English ghost story, thanks to Charles Dickens, but then later on influences people like Henry James and Edith Wharton, and that's part of the story too. The word psychopath is coined thanks to Jack the Ripper in England, and that makes its way over the Atlantic, and then we start focusing on different parts of the American fearscape in different ways. The same way now, there's a lot more in the 21st century, there's a lot more Asian influence in horror than there has been through almost all of America's history. There were times in America when people were afraid of Asians, this thing we call the Yellow Peril. And that I talk about, unfortunately and tragically too, as part of our story of what we're afraid of. But now you watch movies like The Ring or The Grudge, which are based on Asian movies, and you say, or Korean zombie things like or shows like Squid Game on Netflix, and we're like, wow,
yeah, Squid Game was something.
yeah, absolutely. So a lot of fun stuff to kind of put into the mill and talk about,
Yeah. And when we were talking about horror and humor being close together, it popped in my head of Christopher Moore. You probably enjoy him, or if you haven't, you would. Practical demon keeping and right. Blood-sucking fiends. And there are writers who can successfully merge, horror and humor together.
I think that's right. And that's really a very long tradition in the history of horror as well. I mean, if you look at Edgar Allan Poe's earliest stories, he actually is quite satirical and funny. He makes one of his early stories that I talk about, he makes fun of like the leading horror magazine of the time, which was a magazine called Blackwoods that came out of Scotland. And he was like, how to write an article. And it's like, focus on the sensations. And this one woman who is sort of writing down how to like write this article then gets decapitated by the gigantic hands of a clock. The hands of a clock cut her head. And she is focusing on the sensations the whole time she does it, and you're like, oh, Edgar, you got a good sense of humor there, good for you,
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
Well, how do you think that like America's maybe obsession is the right word with horror, do you think that impacted how we have really that and capitalism, how we have built up Halloween? I know that people from other countries are like, what is with Halloween? And now, of course, candy companies are pushing it in other countries too, but we really exploded Halloween. Do you examine that with the horror in your book?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, really one of the interesting things about the story of horror, is that it moved from kind of a general part of the literary and cultural experience into something that was kind of marketed off, right? So, when you said to Edith Wharton or Henry James or Nathaniel Hawthorne, are you a horror writer? They wouldn't really know what that meant, right? They'd be like, oh,
right.
I like all sorts of stuff. But, right. And if you said, well, I watch movies or, that's very early. But starting around the 1930s, you really have these marketing categories saying, this is a horror movie. In Pulp Fiction, these are horror pulps. If you like these, you'll like more of these. And that is the world in which we live in today, where also there's a horror day or a horror month. That's October leading up to Halloween. And that's where you get the special candy. And that's, where we publish books with themes that are
yes, and we wear scary costumes and
100%. And I think on the one hand, as a horror fan like you, I'm like, okay, well, we could do it all year round. That's great too. But it's also
right?
kind of think about a time when we're really focusing on it too. I get both sides of that.
Right. Well, and that kind of leads me to where monsters fit into horror, because I was lucky enough to meet Anne Rice, and she often talked about that when she wrote Interview with the Vampire, she was writing a literary view of how it would be to live forever. I mean, really, the horror isn't the drinking blood. The horror is, how do you stay relevant? How do you live forever, kind of thing? But she was surprised when it came out that it got shelved in horror because it had a vampire. So she's like, am I a horror writer? So I think it's interesting how if there is a monster, boom, it's horror,
and as you say, there really is that surprise there of saying, well, can't you use these in all sorts of different ways. I think I'm a big fan of Anne Rice's. I think Interview with the Vampire is a wonderful novel. I think The Vampire Lestat is a great novel. And to me, what's very interesting about what Rice did, and I talk about her a good bit in the book as a result, is that you take these monsters, these iconic monsters that have sort of such a long life in our culture, and they become different things in different eras. And Rice, in the 1950s, no one was like, here's a vampire that has like a real kind of, for lack of a better word, erotic sensibility, right? You can't and Rice, but that's a real kind of, as you say, sort of tragic, romantic kind of thing. You have a little bit of that earlier on, but Rice sort of really brings that aspect out of it.
And for sure.
What ends up happening is that it becomes a very, she writes right at the dawn of the age of AIDS. That becomes a very interesting challenge for what it means to write about sort of a blood-borne transmission mechanism in that age. And the vampire becomes a major metaphor, thanks to Rice, for that period. In a way that if you look at vampire things from the 1930s, it's really not about that at all, right? They don't really care.
Right. There's something to be scared of, and they're gross.
Yes, that's exactly right. And there's a class, Dracula comes out during the Great Depression, right? The movie, and you have a count from the old world who's preying on people who are not counts. You're like, maybe there's a class dimension here, during the Great Depression.
And also, interestingly enough, Bram Stoker's Dracula also had lots of issues with women. Yes. It was like when I finally read Dracula, the book, I thought, I'm slightly offended here. What?
As I think is rightly so, as you should be. I mean, this is, this is a Victorian novel. Bram Stoker, right? Comes out in 1827 for the people listening who don't know, right? This is really a novel of Victoriana, and where women who kind of dare to kind of be a little bit more agency to, they get put back in their place with, giant phallic fangs and then a big stake that gets hammered in.
Yes.
It's not so subtle in its gender politics, I think it's fair to say.
Yes.
And you have different kinds of vampire mythologies that they try to address that, they deal with it, they exalt it, and I think that also the figure of the witch is very interesting. I mean, if you look at the politics of the figure of the witch in the literature and the culture of 1690s America,
right?
Yeah, pretty anti-feminist, I think it's fair.
Yes, for sure.
If you look at the witch in the 1990s, with movies like The Craft or Willow's character in Buffy the Vampire Slayer,
right?
You say, we're reclaiming this. We're saying this is a source of power and agency and autonomy. And it's still a witch, but they're very, very different.
Right, for sure. Yeah, definitely. If I went to Salem, I write paranormal romance novels. So I have some sexy vampires and powerful witches and things like that. So I've been to Salem for book research and things. And it's very interesting when you get there and you hear about these women. It was really like this fanatical thing that I can't help tying to, patriarchal religion. Yeah. We can't be having women, and it's very threatening that women actually give birth. And, and that was very threatening to the men who are supposed to be, the powerful, and Eve tempted us with the apple. And, horror really goes way back.
It absolutely, and I think you're so right to focus on these continuities, these things. One of the things that I talk about in the book is we're afraid of big things up there, but also the person next door.
Right.
And the prime card in that deck has always been for patriarchal societies, women. That's always, and you had these sources in Massachusetts Bay of women who could have their own power, but they could be folk healers, they could be widows. And of course,
midwives were too powerful.
They had the power of life. I mean, in fundamental way. And so, that could not be abided by the Puritan fathers, right? Obviously, intentionally. And it's not surprising that becomes sort of a real focus, not the sole focus, right? There were also males who were brought up, but really the prime focus of the Salem witchcraft trials.
Right. Yeah. You can't be having uppity women.
No.
No.
And would that concern had stopped in the 1690s, right?
Right. We're still dealing with it.
Right. And go on. Go.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I think that kind of, as far as horror fiction and horror movies go, I think that kind of is the angle of the appeal, is because it gives us the ability to kind of experience that fear without having to experience it in real life. Unfortunately, the Salem witch trials were real, and these people went through this real thing, but we can read and watch movies and experience the fear without having to actually be ourselves on trial. Does that play into your kind of look on why it sticks around?
Absolutely. I mean, that is to me the crux and the essence of why we enjoy horror. I mean, I often say nobody really enjoys real life horror.
Right. None of us want to be scared.
Right? But I mean, if a big, we might love big spider movies or whatever. We don't want to find a big spider in your bathtub.
No.
But this is a way. I mean, and sometimes very serious. One of my favorite stories to teach at Columbia, and I talk about it in the book, is by this really very, very wonderful science fiction writer whose name was Alice Sheldon, but she went by Raccoona Sheldon sometimes, or James Tiptree Jr. sometimes. And she wrote a novella called The Screwfly Solution, in which all of a sudden men, this is written in the 70s, if I recall, men begin to become very homicidal towards women, all of a sudden. And, even, every men sort of threat. And it's a science fiction story, and the reason why they do that in the story is kind of hugger mugger, but it gets to this real fear of the male as being, hostile, even homicidal, right? And so you could read that story and you could say, oh, at the end, I'm going to spoil it slightly for people. At the end,
I think it's past the spoiler deadline.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you for the permission. At the end, it's aliens, right? Aliens kind of spray this thing to kind of cleanse the planet for their habitation, But and you're like, oh, okay, that didn't happen in real life. It was just alien. But of course, that's not what you're feeling when you're reading the story. You're able
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's that feeling it also gives us the ability to analyze things that are happening in the real world in a different light. I always, when I'm teaching like short story writing class, we always look at the lottery from Shirley Jackson, and it sticks around because no matter what time period we're in, you always need to look at something and go, just because we've always done it, does that make it right?
Yeah.
And that story in particular is so horrifying when they hand that little boy a rock. You're like, and yeah, I'm spoiling, but anyway,
you did very well by not spoiling it.
But it's like there's very few, I think, fictional ways to bring something to the forefront where people can be in someone else's skin and go, wait a second, this feels wrong, right?
Yeah. And I think you're getting to something that I always think about with sort of a lot of the horror work that we do, which is this combination of attraction and repulsion, right? Where you're like, I'm looking at it and you're like, wait a minute, but you're like, I'm still looking at it and I want to find out what's going to happen in the lottery.
Right.
Like, this is not going to be good. I can tell.
Well, for me, that's one of the best parts of the lottery is she nailed it with the title, because we all assume that a lottery is good. Everyone wants to win a lottery, and the whole story is so foreboding, and you're like, why is no one excited? Why are people nervous? So the title really is the hook. It lures you in because none of the reactions are what you would expect from a lottery. So anyway, it's very clever.
I think that's a great analysis of it. And I think, if what's also wonderful about that, and so much of art, is that, as you were saying before, it kind of transcends. Like if someone was like, really, the lottery is about, I'm making this up, agricultural practices in this particular region, in this particular
right.
You'll be like, I don't want to, that's not, you've missed the point of the story, right? That's
right.
Even if you were right, you're wrong, right? I mean, that's and that's the thing which is fun is both saying in writing this book, okay, here's how these works come out of a very particular time and place, but here's how they transcend that time and place as well and speak to these broader questions. That was the balance to strike.
Right. Well, I want to turn a little bit toward like you as a writer, because when I was going through all of your website, you have written all kinds of nonfiction things, and they're all so varied, like Mel Brooks biography, and also comics, and you have a YA book. Are there other genres that you are dying to write? Do you have a hard sci-fi in you? I mean, what inspires you to do these things?
Well, I mean, I sometimes say to my wife that I'm really glad that I'm living much of the life that I dreamed of when I was 12 years old. Right? It's,
yes.
Yeah. There's that great line, which but maybe some of the listeners don't, that the golden age of science fiction is 12, right? Whatever it is that
yes.
And so to be able to get up at Columbia and say, like, look, I want to talk to you about Stephen King, or Mel Brooks, right? Or, here's something that's really interesting that teaches you how to think about the world and also how to understand what's come before and how to, and maybe how to make art and make thought and make whatever it is going forward. It's a real privilege. So I'm very happy about that. I will say that it's possible that my next book will be about the 1980s, which again, back for
fun. Okay.
Yeah. There's a lot going on that decade, it turned out. So I think it's a fun thing to think about. But right now, scary.
Yeah, all scary all the time. When, when you are writing, you have a middle grade book that's coming out soon. How do you, as a writer, switch gears for all those different things?
For me, they're very different kind of, well, I was going to say they're very different, but which is true, but in terms of the way that I write them. But in terms of the way I think about them, I'm not sure that they're that different. I once had a professor of ancient Jewish history who said the way that he came up, and I've never forgotten this, the way he comes up with his historical questions is he takes a walk in his head down ancient Alexandria or ancient Jerusalem. He says, okay, so I'm walking past a house. What does the door look like? Like, is there decoration? Are there decorations on the door? And if so, what? And in some ways, I don't think I'm the only one. When you write fiction, I mean, maybe you feel this way too. You write fiction too. It's like watching a movie and trying to get
Yes.
Right? It is. Okay, I'm glad to hear that. Right?
Movie in your head, and you're trying to get all the important parts down, and yeah.
Yeah. And there's a similar thing in writing a cultural history for me that it's like you're looking at something through a telescope and you're continuing to kind of refine. The people on the podcast can't see, but I'm making kind of changing, focusing motions with my hands. You refine the picture more and more, so it gets more and more granular. But it's still that kind of same thing. Like you're trying to watch the movie and see what the story is. So that is similar between the two, although the process is very different.
Right. And writing for a completely different audience is probably
very
a shift
very
also.
I mean, you must find this as well in a different way. Although it sounds like your work is for adults, right? It's but where you're like, oh, okay, I could craft a sentence in this way, but like that's not what this project demands, right? I mean,
right. Yeah. And you know what genre expectations are. And of course, for a middle grade versus a YA versus nonfiction, it's all totally different. So, well, what did you always want to be a writer? I'm guessing by the comics book that you must have always been into comics. Are you living your dream? You always wanted to be a writer, or did that come to you later?
No, I always I always did a little bit of writing, and I always sort of thought that would be a fun thing to do, but I did not necessarily think that I was interested in writing nonfiction. But it turns out that I really genuinely like writing both fiction and nonfiction, which was nice because at least in the part of the university that I spend most of my day in, if you write fiction, you're in big trouble. So, if you write, maybe I should say, if you write fiction and pass it off as nonfiction, you're in big trouble. Right?
There you go.
That's what I mean to say, right? So but I really do like it. But it turned out that what I liked writing nonfiction about were things that like lots of other people were interested in too. And many of my colleagues write really important books about things that have necessarily a smaller audience, and that's great. That's really important. That's how knowledge, advances. But my feeling was, if I'm happen to be writing things that people are interested in, I'll try and write them in as broad a way as possible while still, maintaining, rigor,
the integrity,
the integrity.
Yes.
So that was a fun thing to learn how to do too, is to try and write in that way.
Right. Well, since it is spooky season, everyone who comes on during spooky season has to share with us your favorite scary movie and favorite scary novel.
Oh, wow. Okay. So my favorite scary novel, this is going to be, I apologize for being stunningly conventional in this, but I just reread all 1,135 pages of it, and my opinion still stands. It is Stephen King's It. I'm there it is.
Okay. All right.
I think it is, it says the most for me about a certain kind of horror fiction, about the interaction between classic supernatural monstrosity and a kind of coming of age sort of world of the post-war generation, and what the encounter between real life and the supernatural might look like. It's I would say if you've seen the movies, that's great. There's some great movie versions, but like go back and read the novel.
Well, yeah. I would counter with I fall with The Stand and The Shining kind of thing, but what puts it above The Stand for you?
So I love this. I mean, this is like asking,
I know.
Right. So I love The Stand. I think The Stand is great. I particularly love, I just saw there's going to be this anthology of tales from the world of The Stand.
Oh, that's cool.
With like a murderer's row, you should excuse the expression, of just wonderful contemporary talent. I think that for me, The Stand, the end of the world part is phenomenal, and then it takes a little longer than I need to get. But this is like looking at the Sistine
Chapel
and being like, yeah, are there The Shining, I think, is a great novel. I think
I love The Shining.
The Shining
so scary.
And what's interesting to me is, and I don't know whether you felt this way, it hit me very differently reading it as an adult who has a wife, who has a kid, who has a family.
Right.
Than when I read it first as a teenager, where I was like, oh, it's a spooky hotel. And now I'm like, no, he's the monster,
Yes. It's much scarier after you have a kid and you have read The Shining. But, that's an interesting one where I think the movie, The Shining, I thought the ending of it missed the mark completely, because in the book there was a tiny redemption of the dad, which made it all worth it to me. At the very end, he sacrifices everything. He comes back to himself. But in the movie, he just freezes to death. If he hadn't frozen to death, they'd be done. And so I thought, wow, you guys read that book and you missed the whole thing.
I think for Kubrick, in many ways, it wasn't really about a narrative.
Right.
It wasn't about a journey. I mean, which I think was about image and, like we said before with Poe, about sensation. Right. And to me, that actually, I agree with you. I mean, to me, that makes it less
scary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But for the performances that he got out of Nicholson and Shelley Duvall, who is like a special effect in this movie.
Yes.
Okay, I can understand why you're leaning on the sensation when you get these sensational performances, in all sense.
Yes. But man, that book has those scary moments of he's been working on his book all day and he shows it, she's reading. It's just all work and no play, make Jack and no boy. Okay, terrified.
And like you're saying, they're earned through these hundreds of pages of psychological analysis of Jack that allow us to see him as someone who's a redemptive too.
Yes.
And it's hard. It's not impossible. I'm not saying, but it's much harder to put that in the movie. I mean,
in a movie, right?
Yeah. So I kind of agree with King that it's not the most successful adaptation, but on different grounds. Because I almost don't think it's an adaptation at all. It's sort of its own.
Right. They just took the scary parts of the book and they put them all in the movie.
Exactly.
Yeah. Also have to ask you, were you a big Halloween fan when you were a kid? What's your favorite Halloween costume?
Oh, good question. The truth is that I grew up in a traditional Jewish household, so we did not go trick-or-treating.
Oh, no trick-or-treating for you.
Trick-or-treating. We gave out treats to people who came.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, so that was very, so we didn't really go out trick-or-treating ourselves. So it's still fun to kind of do that and give these out. I will say that I always liked surreal costumes. I don't know, maybe the comedy side. So when I was in college, I went once as myself, only slightly taller.
How did you do that? Did you learn to walk on stilts?
I just sort of stood on tiptoes whenever anyone asked the question. So it was a cheap costume, but
for sure.
But I did enjoy that. So those are, I can't remember, but when people who come as like puns and things like that, I always enjoy those kind of costumes to watch.
Right. One of my favorite ones, when my kids were in high school, they dressed up and lots of kids at school did. And my favorite one that one of their friends did was they had just covered themselves in double-faced tape and put all kinds of candy wrappers and stuff on them. And they were the floor of a movie theater.
Oh, that's brilliant.
I was like, oh, that is genius. Genius idea.
Those are the ones I love where, you're just you're really like, Oh, now I get it. That's amazing.
Yes. Yeah. They didn't go to Party City and buy a costume.
Right. That's right. Exactly. So I love that.
Well, it has been so much fun chatting with you. And can you tell everybody, are you doing, is your publisher doing any promotion for the book? Should they go see you somewhere, or are you on social media? How should they connect?
Yeah. So you can, I would love that. You can go to my website, which is Jeremy Dauber, DAUBER.com. And you'll see sort of where I'm appearing, mostly in New York, although on Halloween evening, if you're in the DC area, I will be at Politics and Prose.
Fun.
Yeah, so that's going to be fun. Mostly in the DC area, but there's a list on the website. You can buy the book there via the website or wherever books are sold. So, or check it out at your library. Ask your library to get a copy. So, I'd love to hear what you think about it. You can contact me through the website too. Let me know what you think of it.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, and good luck, everybody who is listening out there. All you Halloween lovers, go grab American Scary. It sounds fantastic, and I can't wait to read it. So thanks for being here, Jeremy.
Such a pleasure. What a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for joining us on Booklights. Be sure to connect with us at www.readersentertainment.com for articles, blogs, videos, and podcasts that matter to readers.